Hello everyone, JD here. This presentation is entitled The Impact of the Early Industrial Revolution. We've got four major subtopics. First of which is the new industrial cities. Secondly, rural environments. Thirdly, working conditions. And lastly, changes in society. So let's get rolling. The new industrial cities. The most dramatic change brought about by industrialization occurred in urban places. And I just want to say it at the outset that when you build a factory, you need employees. People are going to move in from the hinterlands, also referred to as the countryside. And so they'll come in to take these jobs, and then they're going to need places to live and places to buy food and so forth. So what you're going to see is incredible growth in terms of population. In London, they went from 500,000 residents in 1700 to 1,117,000 residents in 1800. Manchester, which is also in Britain, 20,000 people lived there in 1758, and by a century later they had 303,000. And then in New York City, there were 100,000 residents in 1815, and by 1850, just 35 years later, there are going to be 600,000 people, right? In some cases, towns merged and formed megalopolises, and some examples of those would be Greater London, the English Midlands, central Belgium, and the Ruhr district of Germany. So we're going to see an awful lot of urban growth in terms of population. But it's not just the number of people. It's also going to be the cityscape, what you see around all the structures that are going to be built, where people are going to be working in a variety of capacities, and where they're also going to be living. So a great deal of money went into building fine homes, churches, museums, and theaters in wealthy neighborhoods. Much of the beauty of today's London dates to the time of the Industrial Revolution, which that might sound, well, people might think, really? That's what I think when I read about this. I'm actually a bit surprised. But what I want to mention here too is when we talk about people who have more greater means, let's put it that way, they've got greater means, they've got more money. In other words, they're middle class or above. You think about it, they're going to have, they're more affluent so that they can afford a better home. They have more free time so that they can go and enjoy the museum or the theater. That is not going to be the average person who is working in a factory. It has to be stated here. All right. Much of the growth occurred in the poorest neighborhoods, and that shouldn't be of any surprise because that's probably the largest group of people, and these people are going to be working in these for these companies in these factories. All right. Poor migrants streamed in from the countryside. Developers built cheap, shoddy row houses for them to rent because a lot of times people don't make enough money to afford to buy a home. You can't save enough because in order to buy a home, you have to actually save up your money over a period of time. People are going to be eking out an existence in some cases, which means they will not be able to save much, especially if they have children, on those wages anyhow. All right, so population growth caused serious urban environmental problems. There's a list here I want to go through. People threw their sewage and trash out of the windows to be washed down the gutters. So, waste disposal as we understand it in a contemporary context did not exist, which of course, what comes with that? Sickness. All right. The poor kept pigs and chickens to supplement their meager diet provided from low wages that they were making working in those factories or whatever other type of employment that they were able to secure. All right, so if you're moving in from a rural area and you're accustomed to having animals, well then I can understand why some of them would probably have animals with them in the city. However, it begs the question how that actually works, because having farm animals in an urban environment just strikes me as presenting a series of challenges. Okay, the rich kept horses for their coaches. So when pedestrians stepped out on the street, they were doing so at their own risk. It's dangerous. All right, air pollution from burning coal got steadily worse. I mean, you think about the air quality, it's going to be compromised. Many urban dwellers drank water from wells and rivers contaminated by sewage and industrial runoff. An example of that's the River Irwell in Manchester. I mean, you don't want to, you think about it, it's dangerous. And if there's a factory that is located in proximity to a river, there's going to be some kind of industrial runoff from that structure or the property, however you want to phrase it. The outskirts of cities There were railroad yards, sidings, and repair shops covered acres of land, surrounded by miles of warehouses and workers' housing. So it's not just the concentration of people, the congestion. It's also going to be, the visual. You think about how spread out it's going to be as well. The high concentration of people and all of what they need in order to survive. It's not just how they work. It's also where they live and where they get food and so forth. Right. So disease is going to proliferate. We've got rickets, which is a bone disease caused by a lack of sunshine. We also have cholera brought to Europe from India. Observers documented the horrors of slum life in vivid detail. And this is where actually shining a light or illuminating these issues can go a long way to changing the conditions. In other words, if someone writes about it and everyone hears about it, or a lot of people hear about it, leaders are forced to respond because they realize, oh wow, we cannot have people living in this situation. And so shocking reports led to municipal reforms, which means reforms at the city level in this case. We have some examples here: garbage removal, water and sewage systems, parks and schools, right? I mean, think about a park. I mean, people typically really enjoy parks because it's a place for them to go when they're not working. And some people want their kids to go to school because that's an opportunity for them to have a life that's different from their parents. So when someone draws attention to these problems, leaders are compelled to take action. All right, I want to move on to the second major subtopic, rural environments. For Britain and Western Europe, that's what I'm going to be referring to here specifically, almost every piece of land covered with fields, forests, or pastures, shaped by human activity or by towns. People cut timber to build ships and houses. People cut timber to build ships and houses. For homes and to manufacture bricks, iron, glass, beer, bread, etc. Okay. Canadian and American governments seized land from native peoples and made it available at low cost to farmers. And many of these farmers are going to be immigrants. And also to logging companies. Settlers viewed forests not as a valuable resource, but as a hindrance to development. Pioneers felled trees and built homes or houses. Cultivation of cotton in the South is going to be harmful. And I'll explain why. You got to cut down a forest. And if you're going to plant cotton, you got to cut down a forest. And then after you've grown cotton for several years, as a crop, it depletes the soil of its nutrients. It's very hard on the soil in that way. And then people eventually, after that, in some places the soil will be exhausted, then they continue to move westward. Right? And when I think about cotton, I think about the Deep South. Right? Going on from like Georgia on over to eastern Texas. It's not going to be grown in every place, but in many places. Okay. Europe. Raw materials once grown on the land, such as wood, hay, wool, were replaced by materials found underground like iron and coal, or obtained overseas, like specifically cotton. The expansion of iron and coal mining had detrimental effects. I mean, of course, when you think about it, we need these natural resources in order to literally to fuel industrial civilization. However, mining is very destructive to the environment. I mean, you're scarring the earth in a certain way there. Okay. And population increased and the land grew scarcer. I mean, we have more people competing for less of what's available. That can create a problem. Iron became cheaper and wood more expensive. And wood is part of what people are using to fuel fire. But of course, then coal is going to become more popular. All right. Now, let's go on to the third subtopic, working conditions. Industrialization offers new opportunities to some enterprising workers, such as carpenters, metal workers, and machinists, because they're going to be in great demand, as are engineers, people who are going to design these structures. So people who are going to design them, as well as people who are going to build them. There's going to be a great demand for those folks. but that's not going to be the same experience for other types of workers. So to me, if you're a carpenter or an engineer, metal worker, machinist, you're much more fortunate. Let's put it that way. All right. Most jobs required much lower skill levels or levels of skill than had earlier jobs in artisan production and were repetitive and boring. I want to say this at the outset. If you were an artisan, you actually went through the process of learning how to manufacture a good from start to finish. And usually you have to be an apprentice. Okay. And then you go through this process where you're learning, and then perhaps at some point down the line, you can have your own shop. But you are able to how do I want to phrase it, manufacture a specific good from start to finish. And so there's a certain level of pride there. There's certain knowledge there. And, there's the experience that you build up over time. But when you're working in a factory, that doesn't exist because it's an unskilled job, right? It's unskilled labor. And the people who work in those places are very easily replaceable. I mean, of course, there are trade-offs, right? Because when an artisan, manufactures an item from start to finish, it takes a certain amount of time. If you're able to mass produce a specific good, you can do far more in a far shorter amount of time. Okay, so there's trade-offs. But what comes with the factories is there's less meaning in the work. Factory system depended on unskilled workers from the countryside. Work did not vary with the seasons or the time of day. It began and ended by the clock. Gas lighting expanded the day past sunset because if you have lights, then people can work longer. Work days were long. There were few breaks, and foremen watched the actual employees constantly, their subordinates. Little sense of achievement or connection to the product. Accidents were common and could ruin a family dependent on wages, and workers had no control over their tools, jobs, or hours. Now think about it, all of what we understand today did not exist. Minimum wage did not exist. Compensation if you're injured did not exist. Benefits packages did not exist. That's all going to come much later, right? But what I'm saying here is your wage could fluctuate. You could get hurt at work, meaning you're unable to show up anymore. And so then what happens to your family? Because if everyone in your family is dependent on whatever the income it is that you're providing, that creates a certain, that's highly problematic for people, right? I also think, the personal component of this, in other words, when you show up to work every day, do you find meaning in what you do? And whatever, it doesn't matter. I've been reading about the Industrial Revolution for years, or shall I say on and off over the years, and at no point have I ever gotten the impression that people could find something deeply meaningful about the work itself. Major impact on women and family life. Young women who sought paid employment became domestic servants despite low pay, drudgery, and the risk of sexual abuse because they could be mistreated by someone else. Women with small children tried to find work they could do at home, such as laundry, sewing, embroidery, millinery, which is making hats, or taking in lodgers, which means people were traveling. Those who worked in factories were concentrated in textile mills because work required less strength than metalworking, construction, or hauling. And I want to say this too about gender roles, in comparison. When you think about it historically, women were not perceived the same as men. They did not have the same rights or freedoms extended to them. And when we're talking about the 1700s, 1800s, even into the early 1900s, whether we're talking Europe or what becomes the United States, it's interesting because there's a certain irony to that, because people in Western Europe and even what will become the United States have often condescended to folks of different places, and yet there's been a number of challenges when it comes to the issue of gender and the way people are treated, or shall I say mistreated, and denied opportunity. So that's been an ongoing issue that still has not been fully resolved. But I bring it up here because I want to be very clear about this when I say those who worked in factories were concentrated in textile mills, and that by those I mean women, because the work required less strength than metalworking, construction, or hauling. That's a reflection of the attitudes of the time. And I want to be very clear, that is not an attitude or a view that I have. I do not think that way of women. All right? Be very clear about this. On average, women earned 1/3 to 1/2 as much as men. And employers sometimes came to prefer child workers, cheaper, and the children themselves are cheaper and more docile, which means they're ready to accept instruction, than adults, and better able to tie broken threads or crawl under machines to sweep the dust. So we're going to have child labor. That's going to be an issue that people are going to be writing about as well, draw attention to. I mean, you have children working in factories, you have children working in mines. I mean, it's dangerous. I mean, it's dangerous for anybody to be around certain types of equipment or in a specific environment. It can be very, I mean, there are a lot of risks associated with it. You can get injured, you could get killed, and we have children working. I mean, some of what I've read about too when teaching United States history about this particular era, you know, there were kids who were working in the mines and they would fall into a mine shaft. I mean, it's just, or they get buried in the whatever it is that they're mining, they would actually get buried in it. The chute, excuse me, they'd fall into a chute and they could get buried alive. And that's, I mean, it's just thinking about it, it's just very sad. All right, so we have Francis Cabot Lowell built a cotton mills in Massachusetts. We're going to talk about the United States a little bit here. Hired the unmarried daughters of New England farmers, promising decent wages and housing in dormitories under careful supervision. So Francis Cabot Lowell tried to create an environment where people would be treated better. Unfortunately, in the bigger picture, that's not going to be what most people's experience is, and it's very difficult to resist like this profit motive. In other words, when people see an opportunity to make money, they want to do so at the least amount of cost to themselves, like if you're running a company. And I'm not condoning this behavior. I'm merely saying this is what existed, right? So saying here, early social experiments were overwhelmed by the profit motive. Manufacturers imposed longer hours, harsher conditions, and lower wages. So what can start off with a really good idea, you need someone who has a really strong personality and a moral compass to make this happen. And that's not going to be a lot of people that are working in industry, you know, own these factories where people are working very long hours under conditions that most people they would look at, they'd say, I would prefer not to do that, right? But it's the profit motive. People there's an awful lot of money to be made. All right, cotton boom enriched planters, merchants, and manufacturers and reinforced and expanded the institution of slavery in the United States. In the 1790s, there were 700,000 slaves of African descent. The number increased, reaching 3.2 million by 1850. 60% of those slaves are going to be living in the cotton region. Thousands of families broken up by the internal slave trade that moved slaves from tobacco regions to the cotton frontier. Slave states limited or outlawed manumissions, which is freeing your slaves, closing door on hope of freedom. And finally here, white American Southerners maintained it was an integral part of both commercial capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. Once again, this is not what I think. This is what these historians have written about that people living at the time period believed. In other words, they thought that slavery was necessary form of labor in order to build up industry to be successful. Now, we say building up industry, and when we talk about this, I mean, think about it for a second. Cotton is a thread that's used for textiles. Well, cotton is grown on plantations. Plantations use slave labor. Factories are not using slave labor, not in a literal sense anyway. Sometimes you hear people say, well, it's wage slavery. And I always think, well, if you're getting a wage, is that technically slavery? And that's exposed a debate people could have. But when you're an actual slave, when you are someone else's property, those people who own slaves believe that this was, you know, important and necessary for them to be successful. Once again, I'm not condoning it. I will say this, slavery never squared with our bedrock principles in this country. It was very much a part of the Southern social order, but it never squared with our bedrock principles. Never. There's always a contradiction there. I mean, you think about it, a system predicated upon individual rights, and yet those rights are not extended to millions of people. And it wasn't just people who were slaves. It also includes free blacks. It includes other people of color, like indigenous people, and then women and so forth too. So there's always been these contradictions or inconsistencies. We have, though, made great strides to try to correct them. Unfortunately, I don't think that work is ever finished, because we still talk about today how women are compensated, 15 to 20% less than men are. And we still have, issues, if you pay attention to the news, that around the issue of race that we have not yet fully resolved. And so the work isn't finished, is what I'm trying to say. And these are some of the historical roots that we're talking about here. All right, so next, the final, subtopic. Changes in society. In Britain, the worst off were those who clung to skills or crafts in direct competition with the new mechanized industries, such as the textile industry. All right, that's an example. By 1811, hand loom weavers' wages had fallen by a third. By 1832, not even 20 years later, they had fallen by 2/3. So people are making, by the 1830s, they're making 2/3 of, or they're making 2/3 less than what they used to make. So I guess the way to phrase it would be, they're making a third of what they used to make. So you're going to see over a decade period there, it starts to drop. And this is also interesting because when you see the factories come into full swing, the people who are used to doing this work a different way in the past are no longer going to be able to make the money they once did. And markets change. I mean, when I read about this, I feel on some level conflicted because I understand that markets change. It's probably unreasonable to think that whatever the conditions are at any given moment are going to remain that way in perpetuity. They simply won't. And that's part of what makes it amazing in some ways and scary as hell in other ways. And certainly at a time like this in Britain or the United States, when there are fewer laws to protect people, right? Or at least there's fewer opportunities available to people. I mean, I should put it that way first. There's fewer opportunities available to some people, and there's fewer laws to protect those people. So there's a certain level of vulnerability that comes with it. As an economy becomes more diversified and there's more options available to more people, then you're not as dependent on making a living one certain way. And then you could actually, you can change direction. And also you think about how education factors into this, because absent of formal education, what are people going to do when they have limited options, right? Or they have limited skills. They haven't been trained to do X, Y, or Z. And then these factories, as I've already said, are places where people are not skilled. I mean, that's how the factory functions. You have a task you're responsible for. And so you complete that task in a series of stages, right? Okay, so that's that. Even by working longer hours at reduced compensation, few could escape unemployment and destitution. So once again, industrialization has mixed results. Workers in mechanized factories had little job security and few opportunities to increase their wages by improving their skills. The poor spent nearly all of their income on food and shelter. That doesn't surprise me at all. During the war years, which is 1792 to 1815, this is, of course, technically it's in Europe and the United States, because even after we had our revolution, we did have a war of 1812 in the United States, which is kind of like the American Revolution Part 2. Maybe it's not a full-on sequel, but hopefully you understand my point. There's going to be war in Europe and the United States. During the war years, the price of food rose much faster than wages, causing widespread hardship. Because think about it. If the amount that you're making for every hour you do whatever work you're engaged in, it's going to be at a certain level. And then the price of food, if it starts to rise, well, then your wages simply don't go as far as they used to. So that means it's more difficult for you to provide for yourself or your family. All right. When wartime shortages ended and exports of British industrial goods increased, real wages and public health began to improve for working class families, which is positive. Prices for food, housing, and clothing fell, and then wages rose. And once again, I want to make the point here. Markets are fickle. Depending on what is happening in a country or a region, and I would say in today's terms, we can speak globally. Whatever's happening in one place can affect what it costs. I mean, and even then it's globally, really, because wars are occurring in different places. So it's like, or at least regionally, or in Europe, and then including in the United States with the War of 1812. I mean, I think that whatever is going on can have like a, how do I want to put it? It reverberates So if you have a war going on, that affects people's ability to make a living, right? And so what we have here, so when the shortages end, exports increased, and then businesses are doing well. And when businesses do well, that has a positive effect for the lives of the workers who are employed there. In 1847, 1848, the potato crop failed in Ireland. Of course, this is another one of those types of events that's going to reverberate. 1/4 of the Irish population died in the resulting famine, and another quarter emigrated to England or North America. Desperate men and women entered the workforce in their adopted countries. And of course, when you have an influx of workers, then wages are going to fall and employment became less secure because there's greater competition, at least in this particular example, according to the book that I wrote my notes from. Beneficiaries of the early Industrial Revolution were men and women of the middle class. In Britain, landowning gentry and merchants had long shared wealth and influence. There's a new group that's going to emerge. These are the entrepreneurs whose money came from manufacturing. Most were the sons of middling shopkeepers, craftsmen, and farmers, and they're going to be self-financed. For as little capital is needed to start a cotton spinning or machine building business, at least at the time. A generation later, which is going to put us in the early 19th century, which means the early 1800s, some newly rich industrialists bought their way into high society. Integration occurred in Western Europe and the United States. Before the Industrial Revolution, wives and merchants had often participated in family businesses. A couple points I want to make here. With industrialization came a cult of domesticity to justify removing middle-class women from contact with the business world. So this is where we see there's challenges when it comes to matters of gender, and specifically in the business world. And came to be seen as a primarily responsibility for women, came to be seen as primarily responsible for the home, servants, and the education of children, as well as managing the family's social life. Some middle-class people attributed their success to efforts and virtues and believed that those who did not themselves were not as successful. They themselves were to blame, which is, a form of condemnation. When you yourself are well off or fairly well off, and you look at other people who have less than you have in your possession. In other words, they're not making as much money, they don't live in as good of a home, they aren't able to afford certain food, they can't engage in certain leisure activities or whatever it is. There are folks who are more middle class who look at people who are poor and say, well, you are responsible for that circumstance that you're living in. Now, what's interesting about that, I've thought about this issue a lot on and off over the years, whether it's in the Industrial Revolution or at whatever other point in time, there has long been a hierarchy in human civilization. Even in different places, there's hierarchies. Now, some cultures are more egalitarian than others. Some are more collectivistic. Others are more individualistic. But I got to tell you, there are hierarchies. And in hierarchies, some people have more and other people have less. Some people have greater security and people have less security. Some people, they're insulated from the problems of the world, and other people are more vulnerable to the problems of the world. You get my point, I hope. What I'm trying to say here is, this is common for people who are doing better to point a finger at someone who isn't doing as well and say that they are to blame for their circumstance, even though they're all operating within a hierarchical society that is stratified. And I've always been a bit confused by that. Because the economic system is predicated upon some form of inequality. That's my thinking on it, right? And if some people have a formal education and can choose a profession versus other people who get stuck working a job who are not formally educated, not literate, and they didn't ever had access to a school, well, that presents, I think, a number of questions we have to ask ourselves. All right. So now, not everyone thinks that way, though. Came to be seen as primarily. Oh, excuse me. I'm looking at the wrong part of my notes. Here's the last point I want to make. Others joined reform efforts to improve education, abolish slavery, protect child workers, modernize poor laws, and reform politics. And so these people are actually going to demonstrate a concern for those who are less well off than themselves. So you have some people who are going to blame the poor and other people who are going to want to help the poor. And what else is new? That seems to be pretty common. A lot of societies are like that. Now, of course, it's going to vary depending on the location, but There are going to be those folks, even in Europe and the United States, who are very reform-minded and they want to change the conditions for the better. Okay, so I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. If you look in the box below the video, the description section, there's a list of resources, other websites that I found. You can go and explore on your own when you have some time. Thanks for listening. Peace.